kind of standard time. Are you feeling ready to go?
Sorry, did you say, am I ready to go? I think the
Sorry,
AI
that's
spoke over you.
yes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm ready to go.
Okay, all right. So we'll begin, and I will begin with our introductions here. Do we have recording? Oh, great. Okay. Hello, hello, welcome to what is, to my immediate recollection, the last session for our visiting lecture series this semester in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies here at the University of Macau, though not the last event for the semester. You should be keeping your ears to the ground about a forthcoming conference. In fact, actually, maybe two forthcoming conferences in our department later this month, but I won't say anything more about those now in the interest of giving today's visiting speaker more time to share his research with us. To that end, we have with us today Daniel Morgan, who is a lecturer at the University of York, not to be mistaken for my alma mater, York University. This sometimes happens. Those are, in fact, different schools. Daniel Morgan has three philosophy degrees from the University of Oxford. Since receiving his DPhil, he has completed postdocs at Oxford, the University College London, and the University of Barcelona before taking up his present post. As far as his research interests and areas of expertise are concerned, Daniel Morgan has interests in the philosophies of mind, epistemology, moral psychology. He's done a lot of work historically and in his postdoctoral years working on indexicality, these kinds of issues intersecting the aforementioned fields. And now he is beginning to do some more work on the philosophy of addiction. And to that end, today he's going to be presenting a talk to us by the title Reaching Addicted Minds. So before I hand things over, uh, I would just ask everybody to come together in welcoming our visitor, and then we will proceed. Okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to this talk, and thanks to the department for inviting me. Uh, I assume my audio is okay. Please tell me if it isn't.
Not only is it okay, it is excellent.
Oh, okay, awesome. There is actually some building work happening quite close to here, so let me know at any point if that becomes a problem. Today's talk is about addiction. Addiction is an extremely important practical issue because so many people are addicted to things, and when someone is addicted to something, the chance of it being harmful to themselves, to those around them, and to the broader society are very high. There's also a lot of philosophical interest in addiction coming from a number of different directions. One reason it's philosophically important, what we think about addiction, is that some theories of moral responsibility are strongly motivated by intuitions people have about addiction. One kind of question that has received a lot of focus about addiction is the what is it? What is the nature of this thing, addiction? Would it be possible to give necessary and sufficient conditions for someone to count as addicted to something? There's been a lot of recent interest in that question. Um, I'm going to ask a question that is at the intersection of philosophy of mind, looking at addiction and ethics, looking at moral status and moral responsibility. And that is why addiction seems to have a morally excusing role. So we imagine an agent doing something that we acknowledge to be a bad or wrong thing to do. And so a certain amount of blame the default assumption is seems appropriate. And then we can imagine scenarios where we add in a new bit of information, namely that the person was an addict, or perhaps even more specifically, that they were an addict acting on an addictive desire. And that, while it might not entirely remove blame, does seem like some kind of point in their favor, even if only a partial one. It seems like our sort of settled conclusion once we know that they are an addict may be that they are less blameworthy than the conclusion we would have drawn if we hadn't known that they were an addict. So let me make that a bit more concrete with this case that I have on the handout involving two agents, one called Carr and one called Fan. And I'm taking this from Nomi Arpley and Tim Schroeder's work in Praise of Desire from 2013, who themselves are discussing an addiction memoir by someone called David Carr, who was a New York Times journalist and a cocaine addict. So in this example, Carr is a real person, and the episode the example involves is taken from his real memoir, and Fan is a fictional person who Nomi Arpely and Tim Schroeder invent for the purposes of making a comparison that illustrates the excusing role addiction seems to have. So Carr, who is a cocaine addict, he leaves his two young children, his two young daughters, in a dangerously cold car for an extended period. And he does that because he wants to go inside of a house that the car is parked outside of, and he wants to get some crack cocaine, and he wants to use that crack cocaine. Okay, I don't know why it is that he couldn't have arranged that the children be elsewhere at this moment, but it's not unrealistic to think that there could be moments when he faces this choice of either endangering his daughters. So it's a matter of endangerment because we're dealing with cold Michigan winter. It's not just a sort of trivial bit of poor parenting. It's a rather serious bit of poor parenting. Anyway, he does that. Okay, so this is a fairly thinly described case. You don't know everything relevant about this case. How long does he leave them there? How cold is it really? Are they really in danger? Or are they just going to be frightened? So I'm not going to fill in any more. Instead, I'm just going to hold all those details fixed and compare with a different case. And now this different agent is purely hypothetical. Fan, he's a sports fan. He does the very same thing that Carr does, but his motivation is different. Instead of wanting to do some crack cocaine, he wants to go into a bar and he wants to watch some sports. In Arpley and Schroeder's telling of this, he's a Vikings fan, which I believe is an American football team. Okay, so they put this point in terms of the contrast between an excuse and an explanation. We have an explanation of why Fan does what he does. He endangers his daughters because he wants to do something else more. He wants to go and watch this football game. But in no way does that seem like an excuse. It just seems like an explanation of what is morally wrong with him. In the Carr case, however, okay, I just need to tell someone who's on come to the door, not to disturb me. I'm sorry, I did anticipate that could happen. Hi.
Is that your car?
Yeah.
Can you pull it out?
Could you? I'm actually giving a job talk at the moment.
Can you give me?
Yeah, I'll give you the car keys. Sorry about that. I'll be free at 11. Okay, I really apologize about that. This
Oh,
this
no
builder
problem. Quite
needed to
entertaining.
move the car. So
It humanizes the speaker so much.
yeah, I bumped this up to a job talk because I wanted to impress on him the need to not disturb me. Okay, so basically the intuition many of us will have about this case is that there is a moral difference between Carr and the fan. Both of them have done a wrong thing. Presumably neither of them is justified in doing what they do, but Carr at least has some kind of excuse. And what we're trying to explain is why that is. And the explanation I give is quite a simple and flat-footed, and I would say unpopular one. I'm not sure I know of anyone who's seriously defended this in the literature. It just says that objects of addiction are unusually motivating. And so the key difference between Carr and the fan is going to be that it's plausible that cocaine is far more motivating to Carr than watching the sports game is to the sports fan. And other answers to the question of why addiction excuses have looked in very different directions, in some ways more involved directions. They've said things like, well, there's something special about addictive desires. Addictive desires are not sensitive to reasons in ways that non-addictive desires are, and you only count as morally responsible on those occasions when your action is sensitive to reasons. So I'm very happy to talk about these other approaches in the Q&A, but the point of this talk is just to defend a positive answer that I find plausible. So I'll just pursue that. If we think about strategies for answering this question of why addiction excuses, one strategy, which I think is the more common strategy, is to sort of lean into a view about what addiction is. That question I already mentioned about what addiction is. So here the approach would be to say, let's do our best conceptual investigation or scientific investigation of addiction. Let's decide on that basis what this phenomenon is. And then once we have a clear view of what the phenomenon is, we've got an explanation of why addiction excuses, and the explanation is not going to be particularly sensitive to what theory of excuses we have. There might be interesting questions about what it takes for someone to be excused, but that's not really a question we're going to need to engage with to understand why addiction excuses. So my take is the opposite of that take. I think that the right thing to do is to think hard about what it takes to have a moral excuse. And I think that with the right theory of what it takes to have a moral excuse on board, we get an explanation of why addiction excuses. That, of course, requires us to say something about addiction, but it requires us only to say something about addiction that I think anyone will want to say. So what it requires us to say is that objects of addiction are unusually motivating. And in particular, it's not going to be sensitive to kind of controversies of a sort that neurophysiologists and philosophers have discussed about what is distinctive about addictive desire in terms of its causes or in terms of how it interacts with the dopamine system in our brains. So I'm sort of defending an answer to the question of why addiction excuses that mentions how unusually motivating objects of addiction are. And I'm also pursuing a strategy that is a bit unusual relative to the standard approach in this literature. So the plan is going to be, of course, first to defend the account of excuses that I'm going to be relying on so heavily. And I call that account blocked inference. Having defended it, I'm going to apply it to addiction and say why I think it falls out of the account that the key morally relevant factor about addiction is that objects of addiction are unusually motivating. And then I'm going to defend the account of excuses from an objection that says that this account makes it far too easy to have a moral excuse, and so it can't be the right way of thinking about excuses, and so it can't be capturing what the morally relevant feature of addiction is, or of Carr's case is. Okay, so this is on your handout now. It's put down just at the beginning of section 1, and I've labeled it in caps blocked inference. This is my account of moral excuses. Of course, we can probably have other kinds of excuse. People talk about excuses in epistemology. uh, in legal context, but I'm interested in moral excuses. So, what's my account of moral excuses? The account says that an excuse is consideration that blocks the inference from a morally wrong act to a morally deficient psychology that explains the action. And what I'm now going to do in advance of defending that account is just to flesh it out by making some comments on some of the key terms and phrases. Um, Blocking an inference. What is it for something to block an inference? So right now, I can see that Ben is wearing a blue shirt. I can see that a couple of people are wearing white. That perhaps supports an inference that I'm within a few kilometers of Ben and of the people I can see to be wearing white. But there's this extra consideration that we might mention, which is that I see them via Zoom. And once we add that consideration, the inference is blocked. We can't infer that I'm within a few kilometers of Ben from the fact that I can see he's wearing a blue shirt, bearing in mind that the vision is enabled by Zoom. Okay, so there's an inference it's reasonable to make. We add some extra fact, it stops being reasonable. That's what it is for consideration to block an inference. It's quite a hydraulic metaphor. Notice that an implication of blocked inference is that we only have excuses in cases when we're dealing with acts that are genuinely wrong. So the idea is that there is a distinction between justifications and excuses. Imagine that a murderer comes to my door. I think this is one of Immanuel Kant's examples. A murderer comes to my door and asks me where my friend who he wants to murder is, and I lie and say I don't know where he is. In that kind of case, it seems like I did the morally right thing in lying. So it seems like it wouldn't really be right to say that my lying was excused, because that would be conceding that there was something wrong about it. But unless you have very strong anti-lying intuitions, absolutist intuitions, you'll probably think this is a case in which the right thing to do was to lie. Okay, so the idea is that excuses kick in where we're not saying, in light of something special, an action of a sort that is usually not justified is justified, but where we're saying, yeah, no, the action was unjustified. It really was morally wrong, but still there's something to say by way of excuse. And of course, that's going to be relevant in Carr's case because it doesn't look like his endangering his daughters is morally justified. It doesn't look as though that's something he positively ought to do, even if it is in some sense understandable that he does it. Okay, so a morally deficient psychology is a bit of a placeholder. Different people are going to have different views about what it takes for a psychology to be morally deficient or morally bad. It means that it's a psychology, a set of psychological properties that you morally ought not to have. Some philosophers think that really what counts is what desires you have. Other philosophers think that what counts is what values you have. We're not going to engage at that level of detail. Um, Let me say why I'm calling this account blocked inference. I could equally, given its content, have called it the moral deficit account of excuses. I'm calling it blocked inference because I think it's really important that excuses play a practical role enabling us in enabling us to make reasonable hypotheses about what state of mind it actually was that led someone to do the thing they did, including the wrong thing they did. So the default, if you are witness to some wrongdoing, is to assume that there is some pretty bad psychology that is expressed in that wrongdoing. Excusing considerations play a role in enabling us to sort of reach the mind of wrongdoers in the sense of like knowing enough about those minds to enable us to judge them fairly, and in particular, to not blame them more than they warrant to be blamed. So this talk is mostly drawn on a draft paper, and in the draft paper, I do two main things to motivate this account of excuses blocked inference. One thing I do is to talk about two cases where I think this general account gives the best explanation of why these cases involve excuses as they appear to do. And another thing I do is to compare with rivals and say what is problematic about the rivals. I'm not imagining that loads of people are massively interested in the various rival accounts of excuses there are. So I'm mostly going to just talk about my positive account of excuses, why I think it does a good job with these cases, but I'll say enough about what some of the rivals are so that if anyone is attracted to one of them, they can ask me about it. Okay. So first case is a case that Gideon Rosen discusses. It involves a soldier. His case involves a soldier who's being tried at The Hague for war crimes after the wars that occurred in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. A soldier carries out a command to execute a civilian. And it's been made clear to that soldier that if he fails to comply with that command, if he fails to shoot that civilian, a couple of things are going to happen. One thing that's going to happen is that the soldier is going to be shot immediately. And another thing that's going to happen is that the civilian is going to be shot by a different soldier. Okay. So the soldier is subject to a very clear threat. It's a case of duress in that it's a case in which it's very tough or difficult to do the right thing. You might even take the view that the threat is so severe and the upside of resisting it so minimal, because the civilian's going to be shot anyway, that this is a case in which the threat justifies the soldier in shooting the civilian. But whether or not that's right, even if we suppose he isn't justified, maybe you should never shoot civilians. Maybe that's worse than lying. The soldier at least seems excused. And the blocked inference account has something pretty plausible to say about why that is. You see someone shoot a civilian, you naturally assume that there's something morally defective about their state of mind. Either they positively are homicidal, they get off on shooting people or something like that, or they're not, but they're just unmoved by the weight of a human life. They don't care enough, they're indifferent. And either of those seems like a pretty serious moral defect. Okay, that's the default assumption, knowing only that they've performed this wrong. But then we add in this extra consideration, which is that there's this very significant threat in place, and the upside to resisting the threat is very minimal. And against that background, different people will have different views to take about this case. I believe the man was, in fact, convicted in The Hague. Of course, that's a legal issue rather than a moral one. But at any rate, uh, we don't think the person's psychology is as morally defective as we initially thought it was. One thing that I want to highlight is that we have excuses of two sorts. One is complete excuses, excuses where there is no residue of blame. We also have partial excuses where we think, even in light of the excusing consideration, we think some blame is appropriate. We just think less blame is appropriate than would be appropriate if there were no excuse. So blocked inference is dealing with that by saying, yeah, you are still entitled to think that there was some moral defect, even in light of the excusing consideration. It's just that the seriousness of the defect is not what it initially appeared. So in this case, you might think this guy should have been a hero. This guy should have resisted the threat. We should judge him somewhat harshly and think that he is something morally defective about his psychology. And the key point is just less of a defect than you would be inclined to judge if you knew merely that he shot a civilian. This is going to be quite relevant in the car case, the addiction case, because there too it looks as though what we're dealing with is a partial excuse rather than a complete one. Okay, so moving on now to the other case. This is a sillier case in a way. So one guy kills another guy. Jones kills Smith. Here's what happens. Jones is making Smith a cup of tea. He goes to wherever the sugar is usually kept. It's labeled sugar. He quite reasonably believes that the white powder inside of that container is sugar. And so he stirs it into Smith's tea to sweeten it. And the sad thing is that, in fact, someone malicious has substituted poison for the sugar. So Jones kills Smith by poisoning him. Although, as he's thinking of it, he's just sweetening his tea. So that seems like a case where we have a complete excuse, where we shouldn't think there's, and blocked inference explains that by saying, if you know only that Jones has killed Smith, you're inclined to think, and you're reasonable in thinking, that there's something defective about his psychology. But once you learn about his ignorance of what the white powder is, his ignorance that it's poison and not sugar, the inference to his having a psychology that is in any way defective is blocked. Jones could be Smith's absolute biggest fan. How he behaves towards Smith in no way suggests malice towards Smith or a lack of care for Smith. The key thing is he just doesn't know what he's doing. Okay, so those two cases, of course, there are other excuse type cases we could think about, but those two are very paradigm excuse cases. And I think blocked inference has something pretty good to say about each of them. Let me give you a bit of a whirlwind tour, though, of what some other views of excuse are, in case you want to ask about them. So Victor Tadros has an account of excuses on which it's just not possible to say anything general about excuses. I'm going to call this the no account of excuses. So in particular, it's not going to be possible in the way that I'm trying to do to have a two-line summary of what it takes for something to be an excuse. David Hume, the great 18th century Scottish Enlightenment figure, ties having an excuse to acting out of character. And in support of that, you might notice that although the two men I've described are killers, they're people whose killing is uncharacteristic. So the soldier, we imagine, is killing because he's carrying out this command because of the extremity of his situation, but we're not imagining that it's in his character to kill. Hume would say that's very important. Likewise, Jones kills Smith, but as we imagine the case, that's a very out of character bit of behavior. Hume says that's why he's excused. Jay Wallace says an excuse is a consideration where once it's added, we should think that an action that appeared to violate a moral obligation no longer does so. So lying, presumably, typically violates the obligation to not lie. Uh, but if we imagine that the lie takes place in the scenario I described earlier, where the murderer comes to the door and wants to know where my friend is, it looks like it no longer violates the obligation to lie for me to lie, because the obligation, if it's a real moral obligation, has to be understood as less than absolute. Something like, don't lie unless there are overwhelming reasons to lie. So Wallace would say, in that case, uh, the fact that a murderer is asking about the whereabouts of my friends is an excuse because it's a consideration where once it's added, it no longer appears to violate an obligation for me to lie. Okay. I will just say, I know I'm not sort of saying why I don't like these accounts, I'm really just describing them, but I will say that particular one seems to lose this distinction between justification, where you're saying, oh, that was a good thing to do, versus excusing, where you're saying, no, that was a bad thing to do, but there's something that makes it an understandable bad thing to do. And I would say that's quite central to the concept of excuse. Oh, okay, so last account of excuses that I'll mention is a more recent one defended by Paulina Sliwa in 2019. There's this famous Nina Simone song, I'm Just a Soul Whose Intentions Are Good. And of course, she in that song seems to be claiming some kind of excuse for herself. On Sliwa's account, that line is the basic form of every excuse. So whenever you have an excuse, it's because you had morally good intentions that somehow didn't issue in morally good action. I think that's a very implausible account. Uh, I think it also risks implying that addiction is never an excuse, since I think it's not very plausible that addicts, when they do things that are wrong, are acting against their good intentions. So I have more things to say about that if you're interested. But in any case, that is our whirlwind tour of some rival accounts of excuses. I'm now going to sort of take blocked inference as established, at least to my satisfaction, and I'm going to try and make it do some explanatory work. So one kind of bit of explanatory work I wanted to do, or philosophical work in relation to addiction, is just to make us confident the car really does have an excuse, because not everyone is going to agree with me that he does. It's going to fall out of Sliwa's account of excuses that he doesn't. And so I want to sort of bolster my confidence that he has an excuse which is intuitive by showing how it falls out of my theory of excuses that he has an excuse. So why does he have an excuse? He has an excuse because his being an addict seems to block the inference from his leaving his children in the cold to his being extremely uncaring about them. Uncaring about them to the extreme degree that the sports fan seems to be about his children. So you just need to think through the case and ask yourself whether you agree with those verdicts. Do you sort of, knowing that this person is an addict, think that there isn't as strong a case for think he's uncaring as you do in the case of the sports fan? If you do, then according to blocked inference, you have a reason for agreeing the car has an excuse. Okay. But I'm primarily interested not in arguing that he has an excuse, but understanding why he has an excuse and what facts about addiction are relevant to his having the excuse that he does. So the question we need to ask, this is on the handout on page 2 near the top, is why the consideration that he's an addict blocks the inference from his leaving his children to his being extremely uncaring about them. And the answer is that if he cares about them enough, or sorry, if he cares about cocaine enough, if cocaine is sufficiently motivating to him, we can't infer from his putting his children second to cocaine that he didn't care much about them at all. So often we have goals that conflict. And in the case where you go for one of the goals over the other, you provide evidence that you care more and are more motivated by the goal you go for over the goal you didn't go for. But that's a comparative claim about how much you care about them. And it doesn't on its own support any view about the absolute amount you care about something. Imagine I have 2 children and I'm a terrible parent and I prefer one of them to the other, and I have to make this terrible decision about which of my parents I'm going to kill or something, and I kill the one um I don't prefer. You can infer, as I've stipulated is the case, that I don't amn't as motivated by this one's welfare as by the other ones, but of course you can't infer that I am a lot motivated by the welfare of the one I kill. Terrible example, but structurally it illustrates the point I want to make. Okay, so we think cocaine's very motivating. All we know in this situation is that Carr has put his desire for cocaine above his desire to not expose his children to a reasonably serious risk of some harm to their health. Uh, we know he cares about that less. We just don't know that he cares about it not very much at all. Okay? So we can also think through this line of reasoning in relation to two of our other cases, the threatened soldier case and the sports fan case. So about the threatened soldier case, say why is it exactly that the threat blocks the inference from his having shot this civilian to his not caring about his moral obligation to not shoot civilians? We can't infer that way because threats to his life are extremely motivating. So again, we just get evidence that he's less motivated by his moral obligation to not kill civilians than he is by his desire to live. But that's compatible with his caring about his moral obligation to not civilians about as much as most soldiers do, and perhaps about as much as most of us would do if we were enlisted into an army. So we're getting the idea that because of the extremity of this circumstance, his doing this very extreme thing is compatible with him having a rather normal psychology as opposed to an extremely morally defective psychology. By contrast, in the case of the football fan putting his children second to watching sports, it looks as though we can infer that he didn't care much about them at all. It looks as though we can infer that because it is reasonable to think that there's a sort of fairly low ceiling on how motivating watching sports is to anyone. Okay, so it's not stipulated, as we described the example, that the fan cares less or is less motivated by football and watching it than Carr is by cocaine. But whenever we think about these thinly described cases, we fill in details that aren't explicitly mentioned, but that are realistic. And one thing that is realistic, I think, is that watching sports is less motivating. Now, we could stipulate that for the very extreme kind of sports fan we're interested in, he's as motivated by sports and watching them as Carr is by cocaine. But I would say that's not the case we initially imagine when we're comparing these two men. And if we do imagine that case, assuming it's even psychologically possible to care as much about football as Carr cares about cocaine, I would say we lose our intuition. We lose the data point that this sports fan does not have an excuse. Okay, so that's sort of the positive story. Most of the energy here has gone into motivating a particular account of excuses, and I claim that it falls pretty quickly out of that account of excuses, that there's a moral difference between Carr and the sports fan, and it's a difference we can acknowledge without committing ourselves to any contentious theory about the nature of addiction. I'm just going to conclude by considering one objection, which more than one person has made to me. And the objection says something like this. I'm going to talk through it in relation to someone who robs a bank. This is section 3 now. The bank robber robs a bank. And they're being, let's say, criticized, and they're feeling defensive. And what they come up with by way of their defense morally is, I robbed the bank because I really, really wanted to, because I really, really wanted the money. Okay? So they're pointing out that money is highly motivating to them, and that robbing the bank was a means to get money. And so by virtue of that connection, robbing the bank was highly motivating to them. And they're claiming that as a good moral excuse. And I take it that most of us will have the view that this is a case in which they do not have a good excuse. They're claiming one, but they don't actually have one. And the worry is that my account of excuses, blocked inference, might predict that they do have a good excuse. Because if money is really so motivating them, it seems like we can infer from them having robbed this bank, or we can't infer from them having robbed this bank to their not caring about property rights at all we can infer is that they care about them less than they do about getting money. So is that an excuse according to my account of excuses? I'm going to say no, it isn't. It definitely isn't. And the key consideration is brought out by the phrase that I'm using the name of the account, the phrase blocking an inference. So remember I talked about that example earlier about whether it's reasonable to infer that I'm within a few kilometers of Ben. That seems perhaps reasonable to infer from the fact that I can tell what color shirt he's wearing, but the inference is blocked once we mention this extra thing that I'm seeing him over Zoom. So blocking an inference is rendering an inference that it's initially reasonable to make unreasonable. And that's required for something to be an excuse according to blocked inference. And I note that that condition does not seem to be satisfied by the supposed or alleged excuse that this bank robber is claiming for themselves. So knowing only that someone has performed the wrong of robbing a bank, we assume that they had some positive motivation for robbing the bank. As Al Capone said, the standard motivation for robbing banks is money. He said, he was asked, why does he rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. So if that's what we know or believe, if that's what we reasonably believe, let's say, knowing only that this wrong of robbing the bank was performed, there's no inference that we're no longer in a position to make that we were initially in a position to make when the bank robber tells us that they were motivated strongly and in particular by money, because we knew that already. So what blocked inference says we need for someone to have an excuse is a reason to think that the psychology behind the particular instance of a given type of moral wrong that's being excused is morally less bad, less defective than the psychology behind a typical instance of that type of wrongdoing. And we don't have that when the bank robber says, I really wanted money, because the default, knowing only that someone has robbed a bank, should be to think that they have done that for the money. By contrast, I am a cocaine addict, said by Carr, does give that to us with respect to the wrong of endangering his children. There are a lot of different reasons one might have for endangering one's children. One might be a bad and uncaring parent, just like the fan is, or one might be subject to an extremely strong motivational force that clashes with you doing your parental duty. And so on my picture, the fact that Carr is an addict counts as an excuse because it tells us which of those situations we're more likely to be in. So I'm sort of trying to navigate between two poles. I want an account of excuses that's undemanding enough that it allows for the motivational force of objects of addiction to be enough that will guarantee that addiction excuses without requiring us to commit to anything stronger about addiction and its nature. But I don't want to tip into saying ridiculous things like that whenever anyone does something because they really, really want to do it, they count as having a moral excuse. But I think there is a way of steering between those two poles. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and I will be very interested to hear what you think.
Anybody want to jump into the queue? Okay, did you want to start us off? Yeah, turn the mic on in front of you there, so it picks up. Yeah, just hit the little, there you go.
Mic check.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it working? Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
So, for me, I think practically speaking, of course, as philosophers, we can infer after the event, but for actual patients, it's not so much about the ability to make inferences, but the having addiction is more likely to putting out a fire. So it's more about how much alternatives you can have. Say for example, the hypothetical example you gave us is that the one that uses cocaine is that when the addicts gets the symptom, they have this fire inside that they have to put off. This is another case for the sports fan is that they do not have this, so they have alternatives that they have other options to conduct. So I have a very ordinary viewpoint is that to be excused, and the definition of what is an addict is how much ability that is reduced for you to do otherwise.
Great. I think that's
I want to hear your opinion on this view.
no, of course, of course. Yeah, so I think that's a very natural thing to say. There's actually been a lot of quite sophisticated work on, ability and control in addiction recently. Someone called Sripada and someone called Dembich have done really great work on this. So I guess appealing to, so I guess you've appealed to inability to not take the cocaine
Mhm.
and also lack of an alternative. So I
Yeah.
guess
At least
those
the
are,
ability is lessened. At least the ability is lessened comparing
yeah,
to,
less ability. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So it raised the question about what it would take for Carr to be able to not consume this cocaine.
Mhm.
Okay, so one view about abilities is something people call the conditional view that says you're able to do something if you would do it if you fully wanted to do it. And then the prediction of that account, I think, would be that Carr is able to not take this cocaine because when he takes it because he wants to take it. He might be conflicted about that, but it seems right to think that his taking it is, expressed by his desires. He's got desires to look after his kids. He's got desires to take the cocaine, and one of them just beats out the other because it's stronger. So if you're tying ability to whether you do it if you wanted to, I think we get the conclusion that he was able to not do it, and so we can't explain why he's excused by saying he was unable to not do it. And you might, of course, say, well, that's a terrible way of thinking about abilities. We need some different way of thinking about abilities. Mm, and one of them might be to say ability is a sort of matter of like being being above a certain threshold of likelihood for actually doing it, bearing in mind certain background considerations. And now you might think, let's include among the background considerations that he has these really strong desires. And so now we wouldn't be thinking as desire for cocaine as an alternative explanation of why he didn't look after his kids from inability. We'd say this inability is sort of constituted by his desires to take cocaine. He's unable to not take it because of the extremity of his desire to take it. Um, I think the English word or the corresponding Chinese or Portuguese word able is likely to be very semantically flexible. And I think it's very plausible that there are contexts in which one can truly say he was unable to not use because his desires were so strong. Um, but in that case, if what we're really doing when we talk about his inability is conveying something about the strength of his desires, then I think that is compatible with the story I want to give. So I would say the dialectic would go like this. We say he has some kind of excuse. We ask why that is. You say it's, well, it was because he was unable to not use cocaine. I say, well, why wasn't he unable? I mean, all he needed to do was just sit in the car with his kids and not go and snort this white powder. What was he not physically able to do that or something? And if the reply is, well, he was unable to not do it in the sense that he had these really strong desires, uh, then I say, okay, but now that's sort of my story about why he has an excuse that mentions the strength of his motivation. So, so I want, so I sort of, I feel like these are very different packagings, but on examination they might turn out to be compatible. And I would claim that the take I've got is more explanatorily fundamental because although your take appeals to an inability, it leaves the question about what the nature of the inability is. And in answering that question, we start talking about strong desires. Anyway, that's my sort of reply, but interested to know what you think, of course.
I think that the ability is compromised because a lot of addicts has to fight off withdrawal symptoms. So they have this anxiety before the symptoms actually kicks out. So there is a reinforcement of symptoms. If someone feel anxious about their symptoms is more likely to appear. So so as I explained that earlier, that there's an urgency for addicts to actually put off that fire inside that you can. So in practice, there's way less time to actually thinking through clearly about all these inferences that we philosophers may later add on to the scenery. I'm just talking about practicalities there. And also, no matter how you think of ability, I still think that the argument is firm to say that compared with the Carr's case and the Fan's case, Carr is definitely have less ability than Vance. That at least, no matter how you define ability or how you think about what ability is, that is still a concrete argument. I think most of us would agree. What do you think?
I think most of us would agree that there's a sense in which Carr is unable, though I think not every, less able, yeah. I think the view that ties abilities to whether you do the thing if you want to is a view that has some pull for some people. I think this is part of why this is a politically contested issue. You know, there are people who are quite, say, especially on the political right, especially or rather not concessionary to the excuse that addicts seem to many people, including me, to have. Yeah, so I'm not really denying that inability should be part of the story. I just think that that's compatible with the story that it talks about the degree of motivation of objects of addiction, because there are all sorts of all sorts of inability, and I think the relevant inability in this case involves strength of motivation. So sort of a sort of friendly reply, like I'm agreeing with you, but I think that if you merely appeal to inability and leave it at that and don't say the kinds of things that I'm saying, you leave yourself open uh, to to reasonable skepticism about whether it's really true that addicts are less able to refrain from acting on their desires than non-addicts.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, would you like to go next?
Here, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay. So Daniel, thank you. That was a extremely interesting talk, and I find your account of blocked inference very, very elegant. And also, I think that one of the main advantages of this account is that removes this idea that maybe addicts are psychologically, morally deficient psychologically, right? So it's in a way, it allows us to consider addiction as not involving some kind of deficiency in morality of for the addicts. So I just want to see what you think about this kind of concern that I have, that is, so in the Carr's example, we have the case of a cocaine addict. But I think that if I provide you with a modified version of these case, we may still think that there is a partial excuse for this sort of misbehavior. So here is this new version. So we are in Macau. So let's call it John, a gambler, leaves his two young children in a dangerously hot car, because here it's very hot, for extended periods so as to go into a casino and gamble. I think that we would like generally also consider, we would, consider that there is some kind of excuse similarly to the case of a car, right? But then we can also consider another case where we have Ted Bundy as the subject of the scenario. And here we have a guy that kills after like very strong motivation that overrides all other beliefs or assumptions or even desires that he has, right? Maybe the desire of not being caught, the desire of not going to prison, right? But in this case, in the case of Ted Bundy, we would not probably find any excuse, right? So here is my worry. May it be that it's actually very difficult to go with the strategy that focus on the view on what excuses are, on the nature of excuses, insulating this from the other big problem of what is the nature of addiction. So I don't know if maybe I know if I'm clear, like we have this kind of idea in mind that the object of addiction, such as cocaine or alcohol, maybe nowadays we would agree even gambling or video gaming may have this like strong motivational force overriding all other desires. But we can extend these cases to like a great variety of cases to a point in which, for some reasons, we would stop agreeing that there is some kind of excuse there. Maybe because at this time, we don't consider, for example, serial killers to be addicts, right? But this is just an assumption that we share and for which we do not actually have any real justification, right? And we can consider other cases. And for example, we can have these fan that is actually a person that spent all his time, even a working time, rather than working, rather than studying, just to watch football games, right? In that scenario, if we give an account of addiction, I still include also cases such as fans, then we have a problem because still we wouldn't consider fan as excused, right? So I wonder whether it's really like methodologically possible to proceed with an account of focus solely on excuse, on the notion of excuse, without considering the problem of what addiction is.
Great. Yeah, those are great questions. I think that in a way, what I would say about the Ted Bundy case versus the gambling case quite different. So let me just first say what I'd say about the Ted Bundy case. And I think one thing this question in my reply, your question, my reply to it brings out is that although I said I didn't want to buy any particular theory of moral defects, I do need to say something about what attitudes I take to count as moral defects. So I think the relevant difference that divides, on the one hand, the cocaine addict and the gambling addict, and on the other hand, Ted Bundy, has to do with the moral quality of the thing that's positively leading them to act. So in all three cases, some moral interest is being ignored, the moral interest of the children who are being ignored, or the moral interest of the victim in not being murdered. But the difference, I think, is that desiring to put cocaine up your nose does not seem like a moral defect to me. It seems morally neutral. And likewise, desiring to gamble does not seem like a moral defect. It seems morally neutral. And those are the two desires that are sort of overpowering the interests of the endangered children in the gambling case and the cocaine case. But desiring to kill people strikes me as a clear case of a moral defect. So I would trace the sort of view, the verdict about Bundy being highly blameworthy, because what would the to that so I what would the excuse be? The excuse presumably would be something like he really, really loves killing people. Um, and so would that block the inference from his having killed someone to his having a morally deficient psychology that explains his killing the person? No, I would say that would be supporting that inference, because I think it's a sort of base fact that wanting to kill people is a moral defect. I can say what I would say about the other cases too, but maybe you want to comment on that first.
Yeah, well, yes. In fact, of course, I think psychopathy, if we consider Ted Bundy as a psychopath, is like a very paradigmatic case of a moral deficiency, right? So I agree with you that we may also look into the specific nature of the act, um, and consider it on at a moral level. But then how do we manage with all the other varieties of cases whereby for our actions, we put others in danger, like the case of the gambler. But then we can also have the case of, again, the person that is compulsively watching football games. And
Okay.
causing
No,
a
no,
lot.
no. I haven't said anything about, yeah, I have things let me just say what I think about that. So, this is obviously quite vexed. Many people, say in 12-step groups, very common in Britain. I don't know if they're big in Macau, but if you go to the alcohol-oriented 12-step groups, these recovery groups where addicts sort of meet regularly and support each other in their sobriety, the alcohol people can be quite sort of skeptical about, say, whether sex addiction is a thing, or perhaps also whether gambling addiction is a thing. And, whenever some celebrity has a sex scandal, the next thing that you'll hear is that they've gone to a clinic,
Yeah.
and maybe they go to a clinic, maybe they don't. I have no idea. I imagine most of those clinics are very nice places independently in the desert or something. But, you know, when you hear that, you sort of ask yourself the question, well, I think that is something one could be addicted to. And this is sort of getting onto the question of like whether it's possible to do the thing I'm methodologically trying to do of not really commit to anything much about addiction. So I think the real question we're asking is one that we can ask without mentioning addiction at all, which is, how plausible do I find it that this thing was so motivating to them that it's compatible with their having put it first in a way that leads them to do some quite serious wrong, that they care as much about not doing that wrong as a sort of typical person would. So And so in the case of the football fan that you imagined, who like is as motivated by football as Carr is by cocaine, it sort of follows from my account that their excuse is going to be equally good, and I think that's okay. But I also think it's super implausible that anyone has ever been that motivated by watching football. I think the moral caliber of addiction as an excuse comes from the fact that people prostitute themselves uh, and lose their houses and, in all sorts of ways bring catastrophe upon themselves so as to be able to act on their addictive desires. I think that makes it plausible that these are sort of super strong desires, and that's the source of their excuse. And when I ask myself the question, like suppose someone said that they were addicted to video gaming and that's why they had to leave their kids unattended for a while. And I'm sort of trying to work out what my moral view about them is. What I would be asking myself is, do I think that they'd prostitute themselves for video gaming? Do I think that they'd risk their house's mortgage for video gaming? And if the answer was yes, I would sort of extend to them the kind of excuse I'm willing to extend to Carr. And I would probably at the same time say, I now think there is such a thing as video game addiction. But it seems to me that the key moral question is one we can raise without invoking the notion of addiction at all. And relatedly, I think even if you had an extremely minimal view about what addiction is, say Gary Watson has the view that addictions are acquired appetites. Like I'm addicted to coffee because even though it doesn't harm me, I always want, or I regularly on a daily basis want coffee, and I have that desire not by birth, but by having consumed coffee in the past. Even in that view, you could say, well, some of these acquired appetites or addictions involve these extremely high motivational states. And that's why sometimes addiction excuses. I think that's the data point as well, that sometimes it excuses, not that it always does. I don't know if that addresses your question.
No, thank you. No, yes, yes. Yeah, thank you very much for discussing this further. Yeah, still I have, but you don't have to respond. I just want to share also this with you. Still I have this idea that when we use scenarios and then we work with intuitions that are triggered from these scenarios, we in some way involve, although implicitly, an account of what addiction is. Meaning, consider that in 10 years from now, we will find video game addiction in the DSM, and we would find in all newspapers a discussion of these video game addiction as a real thing, right? I think that our intuitions related to a scenario where we have, say now, this kind of fan of being a video gamer would change. So this is another way in which I think is not fully possible to isolate the what question from this account. But just sorry, I'm just really sharing my ideas about this very, very interesting account that you provided. Very useful. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, we're moving along to another question.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So my first question is kind of follow the previous question, and it is about the scenario that was provided in the part 3 of the handout. So I want to ask that maybe if we imagine an alternative scenario, it's we imagine a case that this bank robber suffers from pathology, like a sort of mania. I don't know, it's probably something close to kleptomania, and I don't know how do we call it, but suppose that also this pathology is a real thing, then do you think the scenario can be morally excused?
Yeah, great question. And I see why you say that is continuous with the previous one and maybe even with the one before that, because it's sort of pushing at the idea, you use the phrase a real thing, that there's a sort of explanatory work to be done by the notion of disorder or something. And then there's a question about, to what can the relevant objects of this disorder be I'm sort of ignoring, and that not all the work can be done by just how motivating was money to the bank robber. So I don't know. I don't know that much about kleptomania. Um, I don't know if robbing, like, but I mean, I, my stereotype in my head of that is like sort of robbing something kind of exciting and beautiful, like a beautiful piece of jewelry. And I sort of, my stereotype of robbing a bank is more sort of economic gain. Maybe that's not relevant. So I base this is quite similar to what I said about sex addiction or gambling addiction. Like, I feel that if we, say as a society, are trying to adjudicate whether we want to acknowledge kleptomania as a subspecies of addictive disorder, the questions we should be asking are moral questions. They are questions like, are there some people who are so motivated by the goal of stealing jewelry or perhaps money from bank vaults that they're acting on those desires is compatible with their caring about the interests they thereby violate as much as typical people do. So that the unusualness of their behavior is traced to the extremity of how positively they are drawn towards money and not by the extremity of how little they are drawn towards respecting property rights. Um, and so basically my answer is yes. Um, but it doesn't follow that the truth of I really, really wanted to take this money is enough for them to have an agent to have an excuse for robbing a bank, because basically really wanted is so it's like hot, right? So I'm from Ireland. In Ireland we call a day hot if it's about 23 or 4 degrees. In Macau, I take it that a 24-degree day would not typically be described as hot. So there's sort of context sensitivity there. And I think there's tons of relevant context sensitivity around I really wanted. I think if what they're saying is just that, I mean, most of us really want money. We care about money that more than we care about um, quite a large number of other things. And if that's what the person is saying, I would say that's not enough. And if what they're saying when they say I really wanted it is I wanted it about as much as Carr wanted cocaine, then I say yes, if that's how much they wanted it, then they have the same excuse that he did. Um, and I think one of the things that makes this very difficult in a practical way is that we have no I mean, in philosophy, there are people who think it doesn't make sense to compare how motivating a particular desire is for one person and for another person. Like we can't make comparisons across people of how motivating states are. But even if that's intelligible, which I hope it is, which sort of it's very hard to do it in a practical way. We don't have numbers. It's not like when I act on a desire, there's some number between 0 and 10 that measures how strong a desire that is. So I see no better way of doing it than by asking the question, what would this person give up among their prudential interests to satisfy this desire? If they're willing to, risk their life to walk towards the bank vault to steal their money, I think that solidifies the claim they might make to having a desire that is as strong as Carr's desire for cocaine. And if the only evidence of their having a strong desire is that they constantly steal, uh, I wouldn't say that's as strong because I think it could just be that they don't mind violating property rights. Does that make, or what do you think about that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. But I do have another question. Uh, Earlier you mentioned Acquired Appetite by Gary Watson, and it
Yeah.
reminds me of in related to what we call an overpowering or an irresistible desire. There is another contrary account, and someone called it as weakness of will. So, do you think weakness of will is entirely different from the account you've provided, or is it similar?
Um, it's, I, I mean, hmm, it's to some extent, I think like weakness of will is a philosopher's phrase, and what I think about it depends on how it's being used by the given philosopher. So one thing you could understand by weakness of will, and this is actually what would be required for Paulina Sliwa's account of excuses to say that the addict has an excuse, is that weakness of will involves having intentions that get overpowered. So the idea would be something like you have an intention to stay sober at noon, say, and it's not that you switch intention at noon to intending to get high. It's just you retain that intention and it gets overpowered by something that isn't an intention, some kind of like momentary desire. And so you might say, well, the source of the excuse is that their action is not an expression of their intention. Um, and I think that could happen with addiction, but I think it doesn't have to for addiction to be an excuse. And I think that in the case of Carr, the most plausible take on what his psychology was at that moment was not that he had a good intention that he failed to put into action. I think it's more plausible that he perhaps intended to look after his kids and he eventually succumbed to temptation and changed his mind rather than that all the time he continued having this intention to look after them and somehow he acted against that. So if by weakness of will you mean the sort of split between intention and action, I think that is present in only some cases where addiction excuses. If by weakness of will you sort of mean like doing the wrong thing because a very powerful desire that conflicts with doing the right thing is the one you go for, then I think this is a weakness of the will case. But maybe similar to what I said about the very first uh, question, I think like even if weakness of will is what's going on here, I think what's explanatorily fundamental is what we say about weakness of will. Just on irresistible desires, Gary Watson has a very brilliant discussion of. I'm a total Gary Watson fanboy. I think he's completely right in everything he said about addiction, but he has a very interesting point about irresistible desires. He thinks there's something conceptually incoherent about them because the test for whether something is irresistible, he thinks, is whether you could resist it if you sort of did your absolute best to resist it. So if there's like 100 kilogram weight pushing down on my chest, it's irresistible because even with my absolute best, I can't resist it. But his point is that in the case of addiction, we're usually dealing with someone whose psychology who's split, who's being pulled one way by their sort of moral goals and a different way by their addictive urges. So the sort of antecedent of that conditional, would they succeed in resisting it if they did their best, is never satisfied because they can't do their best because part of them is this addictive urge. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on your question.
Thank you very much for your response.
I think this looks like a natural point to maybe bring things to a close for today. With that, though, I think it would be great if we could also, one last time, thank our speaker. Really, thanks again so much, Daniel, for joining us, especially from a distance and at what I suppose was a fairly early time to begin on your side of the pond, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I have young children, so not really, but
Fair enough.
okay, well, thank you so much for your questions. I'm writing this up at the moment, and that's been really helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, nice to meet you all. Bye.